The boy with worn shoes. Jamal shuffled down the uneven sidewalk of his neighborhood, each step an echo of his tired thoughts. The soles of his sneakers were thin, almost translucent from wear, and the weight of his patched-up backpack dragged on his shoulders. It was late afternoon, and the sun beat down on the street, casting long shadows over houses whose paint peeled like old wallpaper. The neighborhood wasn't much, but it was home. As he neared his street, he passed familiar sights. Mr. Davis, the old man perpetually glued to his porch, gave Jamal a small nod without looking up from his newspaper. Mrs. Johnson's flower pots sat in a neat line along her fence, though the flowers themselves were wilted from the heat. Jamal felt a pang of longing for something better, but he quickly shook it off. Longing didn't fill an empty fridge or pay the overdue bills. Finally, he reached his house, a single-story structure barely larger than the toolshed it resembled. The screen door squeaked as he pushed it open, and the smell of flour greeted him. His mother, Maria, was at the kitchen counter, kneading dough with hands that seemed permanently dusted with white. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and her apron bore the stains of countless hurried meals. "Jamal, that you?" Maria called without turning around. "Yeah, Ma," he replied, letting the door creak shut behind him. He dropped his backpack by the couch, a piece of furniture that had seen better decades, and leaned against the wall. "You eat anything at school?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder. Her eyes were sharp, piercing through his casual shrug. "Yeah, I'm good," Jamal lied, avoiding her gaze. The truth was, he hadn't eaten since yesterday afternoon. The free lunch program at school only went so far, and he hated asking for seconds. Maria paused, her hands still in the dough. "Jamal," she began, her tone softer now, "you don't have to lie to me." "I'm fine, Ma," he said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just tired." She sighed but didn't press the issue. Jamal knew she understood. It was always the same story. There wasn't much food at home either. A few cans in the cupboard, a half-empty bag of rice, and some leftovers Maria had brought home from her shift at the diner. He didn't want to add to her burden. Jamal headed to the small room he shared with his younger sister, Alyssa. She was on the bed, her legs crossed as she doodled in a notebook. Her eyes lit up when she saw him. "Jamal," she exclaimed, holding up her latest drawing. It was a superhero wearing a cape, their hands on their hips like they could take on the world. "Look, it's you." Jamal chuckled, sitting beside her. "Me? I don't know if superheroes get this tired, Alyssa." She giggled, unbothered by his weariness. "You're my superhero," she said with the kind of conviction only a child could have. He ruffled her hair, smiling despite himself. Alyssa's innocence was like a patch of sunlight breaking through a cloudy day. She had no idea how hard things were, how Jamal sometimes skipped meals so she could eat, or how Maria worked late into the night to keep the lights on. All Alyssa saw was her big brother, and to her, he was invincible. On the wall above their bed hung a photo of their father. He was in uniform, standing tall and proud. Jamal stared at it for a moment, his chest tightening. His dad had been a soldier, a hero in every sense of the word. But he was gone now, taken from them too soon. Jamal often wondered if he could ever live up to that legacy. "You think I could be like him one day?" he asked Alyssa, pointing to the photo. She nodded without hesitation. "You can be anything." Jamal looked down, his jaw clenching. He wished he could believe that as easily as she did. The next day at school was no better than the last. Jamal kept his head down, navigating the crowded hallways like a ghost. He avoided eye contact, especially with Travis and his crew. They were waiting by the lockers, their voices loud and obnoxious. Jamal knew they'd target him if they saw him, and he wasn't in the mood for another round of insults. "Hey, Jamal," Travis's voice rang out, cutting through the din of the hallway. Jamal winced, his shoulders tensing. He tried to walk faster, but it was too late. Travis and his friends were already surrounding him. "Those shoes look like they're older than you," Travis sneered, pointing at Jamal's worn sneakers. The others laughed, their jeers echoing in Jamal's ears. He kept his gaze on the floor, gripping the straps of his backpack tightly. He didn't want to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. "Still think you're going to be a soldier like your dad?" Travis jeered, stepping closer. "They don't take charity cases, you know." Jamal felt his fists clench, but he didn't say anything. He'd learned a long time ago that fighting back only made things worse. A teacher's voice called from down the hall, and the group scattered, leaving Jamal alone by the lockers. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Jamal went through the motions, but his mind was elsewhere. The words echoed in his head, each one a reminder of how far he was from the life he wanted. By the time he got home, he was emotionally drained. Maria was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands folded tightly. Jamal knew that look. Serious, worried. "We need to talk," she said as soon as he walked in. Jamal's stomach sank. He dropped his bag by the door and sat down across from her. "What's up?" he asked, bracing himself. Maria hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her apron. "The electricity bill," she said quietly. "It's due in 3 days. I don't know how we're going to pay it." Jamal felt a lump form in his throat. He glanced at Alyssa, who was drawing at the other end of the table, blissfully unaware of the tension in the room. Looking back at Maria, he saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight she carried every day. "We'll figure it out," Jamal said, though he didn't know how. The words felt hollow, but he had to say them. For her, for Alyssa. Maria nodded, but her gaze stayed fixed on the table. "I hope so," she whispered. That night, Jamal lay on his mattress, staring at the ceiling. His thoughts were a chaotic swirl of frustration and helplessness. He wanted to help his family, to make things better, but he didn't know where to start. He turned over, looking at Alyssa as she slept peacefully beside him. For her, he told himself, "I have to keep trying for her." As he drifted off to sleep, he made a silent promise. Someday, things would be different. Someday, he'd find a way to give his family the life they deserved. An unexpected encounter. The morning air was crisp as Jamal walked to school, his breath forming small clouds that quickly dissipated. The city was quieter at this hour, and for once, Jamal welcomed the silence. It gave him time to think. His mind kept circling back to the unpaid electricity bill, the empty fridge, and the taunts from Travis. He felt like he was carrying the weight of the world on his small 14-year-old shoulders. As he approached the corner where the old hardware store stood, Jamal noticed a figure struggling at the edge of the sidewalk. An elderly man, dressed in a worn military jacket adorned with faded patches, sat in a wheelchair. He was trying to push himself up the steep ramp that led to the store entrance, but the wheels of his chair seemed stuck. The man's hands trembled as he gripped the rims, his face scrunched in concentration and frustration. Jamal hesitated for a moment. He didn't know the man well, but he'd seen him around the neighborhood. People called him Mr. Henderson. Jamal had overheard whispers that he was a war veteran who'd fallen on hard times. Something about the man's struggle struck a chord deep in Jamal. Maybe it was the jacket, a reminder of his own father's service, or maybe it was the way Mr. Henderson's struggle mirrored his own in some intangible way. Without thinking twice, Jamal walked over. "Need a hand, sir?" The old man looked up, his eyes weary but sharp. He hesitated, pride flickering in his expression, before giving a small nod. "If you don't mind, son, this ramp's got a mind of its own." Jamal stepped behind the wheelchair, gripping the handles firmly. "I got you," he said, his voice steady. With a bit of effort, he pushed Mr. Henderson up the ramp. The chair was heavier than he'd expected, but he kept at it, gritting his teeth until they reached the top. Mr. Henderson let out a breath of relief. "Thank you, son," he said, turning to look at Jamal. "Not many kids these days would stop to help an old man like me." "It's no problem," Jamal replied, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You served, right?" "My dad was in the military, too." The old man's eyes softened. "That's so. What branch?" Army, Jamal said, a hint of pride in his voice. He was stationed overseas. Mr. Henderson nodded solemnly. Takes a lot to serve. Sounds like your dad was a good man. Jamal swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to reply. Instead, he just nodded. Mr. Henderson must have noticed the change in Jamal's expression, but he didn't press. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small silver coin, smooth and shiny despite its age. Here, he said, holding it out to Jamal. It's a challenge coin. We used to give these to soldiers who went above and beyond. I don't have much to give these days, but you earned this. Jamal hesitated, unsure if he should accept. But the sincerity in Mr. Henderson's eyes convinced him. He took the coin carefully, feeling its cool surface against his palm. Thank you, sir, he said softly. Mr. Henderson gave him a small salute. You've got a good heart, kid. Don't lose that. Jamal nodded, his chest swelling with a mix of pride and gratitude. As he walked away, the coin felt heavy in his pocket, like it carried more than just metal. It carried a promise, a reminder of who he wanted to be. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Jamal's mind kept drifting back to Mr. Henderson. The old man's words stuck with him, a rare moment of encouragement in a world that often felt cold and indifferent. For the first time in a long while, Jamal felt like maybe he was capable of something more. After school, Jamal returned home to find Maria sitting at the table, her hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug. She looked up as he entered, her expression weary but hopeful. "How was school?" she asked. "Fine," Jamal said, dropping his bag by the door. He hesitated for a moment before pulling the coin out of his pocket and holding it up. "I helped Mr. Henderson today. He gave me this." Maria's eyes widened as she took the coin, running her fingers over its surface. "That's a challenge coin," she said, her voice tinged with awe. "Your dad used to talk about these. Said they were given to the best of the best." Jamal felt his cheeks flush. "It's not a big deal," he muttered, looking away. Maria reached out and touched his arm. "It is a big deal, Jamal. You're a good boy, and people see that. Don't sell yourself short." Her words warmed something inside him, but they also brought back the nagging sense of inadequacy he couldn't shake. He wanted to be good, to be enough, but the weight of their struggles made him feel like he was always falling short. That night, as Jamal lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the coin sat on the small crate that served as his nightstand. He turned it over in his fingers, the smooth edges calming him in a way he couldn't explain. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to dream, not of escaping, but of overcoming. He thought of his father, of the strength it must have taken to serve and sacrifice, and he thought of Mr. Henderson, who had seen something in him worth honoring. Jamal didn't know what the future held, but as he closed his eyes, he made a silent vow. He would find a way to make things better, for himself and for his family. He didn't know how yet, but he would figure it out. The next morning, Jamal woke to the sound of a car engine rumbling outside. He frowned, rubbing his eyes as he climbed out of bed. Peeking through the tattered curtains, his jaw dropped. Parked in front of their house was a sleek black limousine, its polished surface gleaming in the early morning light. "Ma," Jamal called, his voice cracking with a mix of excitement and confusion. Maria appeared in the doorway, her brow furrowed. "What is it?" she asked, pulling her robe tighter around her. Jamal pointed to the window. "Look." Maria's eyes widened as she took in the sight. "What on earth?" The door to the limousine opened, and Jamal's heart skipped a beat as he saw Mr. Henderson step out, followed by a man in a sharp suit. The man was tall, with silver hair, and a commanding presence that made Jamal's stomach churn with nervousness. "Jamal, come on," Maria said, tugging him toward the front door. Alyssa peeked out from behind her, her eyes wide with curiosity. As they stepped onto the porch, Mr. Henderson gave Jamal a wide grin. "Morning, kid. Thought we'd pay you a visit." The man in the suit stepped forward, extending a hand to Jamal. "Good morning," You must be Jamal. My name is Charles Whitmore. Jamal shook his hand, his palms sweaty. Nice to meet you, sir, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Whitmore smiled warmly. I've heard a lot about you. Mr. Henderson here has been singing your praises. Jamal glanced at Mr. Henderson, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. Thank you, Jamal said, unsure of what else to say. Mr. Whitmore turned to Maria, his expression softening. I understand things have been tough for your family. I'd like to help, if you'll let me. Maria's eyes filled with tears, and she glanced at Jamal, her hand resting on his shoulder. Jamal felt his chest tighten. He didn't know what this man's offer entailed, but something about the way Mr. Whitmore spoke made him feel like maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. The choice of a lifetime. Jamal stared at Mr. Whitmore, his mind racing. Offers of help didn't come often in his world, especially ones delivered in a limousine. The polished vehicle gleamed against the cracked pavement of their street, a stark contrast that made the moment feel surreal. He glanced at his mother, Maria, who stood frozen beside him, her face a mix of hope and hesitation. Alyssa peeked from behind Maria, her wide eyes reflecting curiosity rather than understanding. Mr. Henderson broke the silence, his voice gruff but kind. Son, sometimes life gives you a break. This might be one of those times. Jamal shifted his weight, his worn sneakers scraping against the concrete porch. He thought about Travis's taunts, the empty fridge, and the unpaid electricity bill. This offer could mean relief, real relief, for his family. But deep down, a voice nagged at him. Was it pride? Fear? Whatever it was, it kept him rooted in uncertainty. What kind of help? Maria finally asked, her voice careful. She had learned to tread lightly with offers that seemed too good to be true. Mr. Whitmore gave a reassuring smile. It's not charity, Mrs. Hayes. It's an investment in your son, in your family. Mr. Henderson told me about Jamal's kindness, and it moved me. I believe in rewarding good deeds. I'd like to cover your immediate needs. Pay your bills, stock your kitchen, provide some breathing room. And for Jamal, I want to ensure his education is taken care of. There's potential in this boy, and I'd hate to see it wasted because of circumstances. Maria's breath caught, and she turned to Jamal. Her eyes, glistening with tears, searched his face for an answer. She'd worked so hard, given so much, and now this chance stood before them. But she wouldn't decide for him. This was his moment. Jamal felt the weight of their stares, his mother's hope, Alyssa's innocence, and Mr. Henderson's quiet encouragement. He swallowed hard. Why me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. There are so many people who need help. Why pick me? Mr. Whitmore stepped closer, his expression thoughtful. Because kindness is rare, Jamal. You didn't know who Mr. Henderson was, but you stopped to help him. You didn't expect anything in return. That's the kind of character I want to support. You deserve a chance to see what you can do with your life. Jamal looked down at his hands, calloused from too many days of doing odd jobs around the neighborhood. He thought of his father's photo on the wall, the weight of living up to that legacy. He thought of Maria, her hands raw from washing dishes at the diner, and Alyssa, her shoes a size too small because there was no money for new ones. It wasn't just about him. It was about them. He took a deep breath and nodded. Okay, he said, his voice steadier now. I'll do it. Maria let out a shaky sigh, her shoulders sagging in relief. Mr. Whitmore's smile widened, and Mr. Henderson gave Jamal a firm pat on the back. That's the spirit, kid, the old veteran said. You won't regret this. That evening, their house was filled with a sense of hope that hadn't been there in years. Mr. Whitmore and Mr. Henderson had stayed for a while, discussing plans with Maria and Jamal. They'd make arrangements to pay off the overdue bills first, ensuring the lights would stay on and the water would keep running. Then came groceries, real ones, not just the canned goods and scraps they were used to. For Jamal, The biggest change was the promise of educational support. Mr. Whitmore had connections with local schools and programs, and he wanted to make sure Jamal had access to the resources he needed to excel. There was even talk of summer programs that could help him prepare for college, something Jamal had barely dared to dream about. After the men left, Maria cooked dinner. Nothing fancy, just rice and beans, but the atmosphere at the table was different. Alyssa chattered about superheroes, her excitement infectious, while Maria's laugh came easier than it had in months. "Jamal," Maria said, her tone gentle but firm, "I'm proud of you." He looked up from his plate, startled. "For what?" "For being brave," she said simply. "It's not easy to accept help. I know that better than anyone. But you did it, and that's a big step." Jamal nodded, unsure how to respond. He didn't feel brave. He felt scared of failing, of not living up to the expectations that came with this opportunity. But he didn't say that. Instead, he forced a smile and said, "Thanks, Ma." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of change. The first sign of improvement came in the form of a delivery truck that pulled up in front of their house one sunny afternoon. Jamal and Maria watched in amazement as workers unloaded bags of groceries, boxes filled with fresh produce, meat, and pantry staples. Alyssa squealed with delight when she saw the cartons of milk and the box of her favorite cereal. For Jamal, the changes were more gradual but just as profound. Mr. Whitmore had arranged for him to meet with a mentor, a man named Mr. Patel who ran an after-school program for underprivileged kids. The program focused on leadership, academic support, and building self-confidence, things Jamal desperately needed. At first, Jamal was hesitant. The program was filled with kids from all over the city, and many of them seemed more confident, more outgoing than he felt. But Mr. Patel had a way of making everyone feel seen. He challenged Jamal to think about his future, to set goals and work toward them. "What do you want to be, Jamal?" Mr. Patel asked one afternoon as they sat in his small office. Jamal hesitated. The question felt too big, too daunting. "I don't know," he admitted. "I just want to help my family." "That's a good start," Mr. Patel said, nodding. "But helping your family doesn't mean you can't have dreams for yourself. Think about it. If you could do anything, be anything, what would it be?" Jamal thought of his father, standing tall in his uniform. He thought of the way Alyssa called him her superhero. Slowly, he began to speak. Maybe something like my dad. He was in the army. He made a difference." Mr. Patel smiled. "Then that's your goal. We'll figure out how to get you there." At home, Maria seemed lighter, freer. With the bills paid and food on the table, she could finally focus on spending time with her kids. She started teaching Alyssa how to bake, her laughter filling the small kitchen as they worked together. For Jamal, seeing his mother smile again was worth more than anything Mr. Whitmore could have given them. One evening, as Jamal sat at the table working on his homework, Maria placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're doing great," she said softly. Jamal looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean you've stepped up," she said. "Not just for us, but for yourself. Your dad would be so proud." Jamal felt his chest tighten at her words. He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Thanks, Ma." One day, as Jamal walked home from the after-school program, he saw Mr. Henderson sitting on his porch. The old man waved him over, and Jamal jogged up the steps. "How's the new life treating you, kid?" Mr. Henderson asked, his eyes twinkling. Jamal shrugged, though a smile tugged at his lips. "It's different. Good, I think." Mr. Henderson chuckled. "You'll get used to it. Just remember, it's not about where you start. It's about where you're going." Jamal nodded, the weight of those words sinking in. He was going somewhere, even if he didn't know exactly where yet. For the first time in a long time, he felt like the future was something to look forward to, not something to fear. As he walked home, the sun setting behind him, Jamal felt a quiet sense of determination settle in his chest. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was building something, something worth fighting for. A new road to walk. The weeks turned into months, and life at home began to feel like something out of a dream. For the first time in years, the house was warm and full of light, literally, with the electricity bill paid and the refrigerator humming with life. Jamal often found himself opening the door just to marvel at the abundance inside. Fresh vegetables, milk, eggs, bread, and even Alyssa's favorite peanut butter lined the shelves. The gnawing anxiety that had once gripped him every time he opened the fridge was gone. Jamal wasn't used to this kind of stability, and though he appreciated it, it also felt strange. He'd spent so long worrying, planning, and bracing for the next crisis that the absence of those things left a void he didn't know how to fill. But Mr. Patel wasn't about to let him flounder. The after-school program had quickly become a second home for Jamal. Each afternoon, he found himself drawn to the modest building, a converted community center with peeling paint but a vibrant energy inside. Kids of all ages filled the rooms, their voices blending into a chaotic symphony of chatter, laughter, and the occasional shot of frustration over a chess game or a math problem. Jamal thrived there. He'd started to make friends, real ones, not just classmates who ignored him when Travis and his gang started their daily rounds of teasing. These kids were different. They didn't care about his shoes or his clothes or the size of his house. What mattered was how fast he could sprint during soccer drills, how much he knew about history, or how he always seemed to find the right words when someone was feeling down. "Leadership looks good on you," Mr. Patel said one afternoon as he handed Jamal a clipboard. The program was hosting a small community fundraiser, and Jamal had been put in charge of organizing the younger kids. "Leadership?" Jamal asked, raising an eyebrow. "I'm just keeping them from fighting over the lemonade stand." Mr. Patel laughed. "That's leadership too. It's not always about big speeches or medals, Jamal. Sometimes it's just about being the person others look to when they need help." Jamal thought about that as he watched the younger kids bustling around the fundraiser. He saw himself in some of them, unsure, struggling, but desperate for someone to see their worth. For the first time, he wondered if maybe he could be that person. At home, things were changing too. Maria had started taking evening classes at the local community college. With the support from Mr. Whitmore, she could afford to work fewer hours at the diner, giving her time to pursue something she'd always dreamed of, becoming a nurse. "It's never too late," she told Jamal one night as they sat at the kitchen table. She was poring over a textbook, her brow furrowed as she highlighted passages. "I want Alyssa to see that. I want you to see that too." Jamal smiled, watching his mother with a newfound admiration. He'd always known she was strong, but seeing her chase her dreams, even after all the setbacks life had thrown at her, was something else entirely. Alyssa, for her part, had blossomed. With a full belly and a warm home, her energy seemed boundless. She spent her days drawing superheroes, her sketchbook filling up with colorful capes and masks. She even started adding new characters to her stories: her big brother, her mom, and sometimes even Mr. Henderson. "You're the wise old mentor," she told Mr. Henderson one day when they visited him. "Wise, huh?" Mr. Henderson replied, chuckling. "I'll take that." One Saturday morning, a letter arrived that would change everything again. It was addressed to Jamal, written on thick, cream-colored paper. The return address caught his eye immediately: Whitmore Educational Trust. He opened it with trembling hands, Maria and Alyssa watching expectantly. The letter was brief but powerful. "Dear Jamal, we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted into the Whitmore Leadership Academy summer program. This program is designed for students who demonstrate exceptional character, leadership potential, and a commitment to their community. We look forward to seeing you excel. Sincerely, Charles Whitmore." Jamal stared at the words, unable to process them. "A summer program," he murmured. Maria leaned over his shoulder, reading the letter. "Jamal, this is amazing," she exclaimed, her voice filled with pride. This could open so many doors for you." Alyssa clapped her hands. "You're going to be a leader, Jamal, just like in my drawings." Jamal felt a mix of excitement and fear. The program sounded incredible, but it also sounded big, bigger than anything he'd ever done before. Could he really measure up to the kind of students who'd be there? The first day of the program arrived faster than Jamal expected. Mr. Whitmore himself had arranged for transportation, and a sleek black car arrived at their house to take Jamal to the academy. Maria hugged him tightly before he left, whispering, "Be yourself. That's enough." Alyssa handed him a small sketch, a picture of him in a cape standing in front of a group of kids. "For good luck," she said. Jamal tucked the drawing into his backpack, his heart swelling. He wasn't just going for himself. He was going for them. The Whitmore Leadership Academy was unlike anything Jamal had ever seen. The campus sprawled over acres of lush green fields, with brick buildings that seemed to glow in the sunlight. Students from all over the city, some even from other states, were there, their faces a mix of excitement and determination. Jamal felt out of place at first. His sneakers, though newer thanks to Mr. Whitmore's help, still felt inadequate compared to the polished shoes and designer backpacks he saw around him. But he reminded himself of something Mr. Henderson had told him. Courage isn't about not being scared. It's about showing up anyway. So Jamal showed up. The program was intense. Mornings were filled with leadership workshops, where they discussed concepts like teamwork, resilience, and problem-solving. Afternoons were dedicated to community projects, where they worked on real-world challenges like organizing food drives or mentoring younger kids. Jamal quickly realized that while many of the other students were more confident or experienced, he had something they didn't: grit. When a project got tough, or when a group couldn't agree on a solution, Jamal's quiet determination often became the anchor that brought everyone together. One day, during a particularly heated debate about a community outreach project, one of the facilitators pulled Jamal aside. "You've got a gift," she said. "You don't need to be the loudest voice in the room to lead. Keep using that calm strength of yours." Jamal thought about her words long into the night. Maybe leadership wasn't about being the biggest or the best. Maybe it was about being someone others could rely on. By the end of the program, Jamal had not only gained confidence, but also a new sense of purpose. He'd made friends, learned new skills, and even discovered a passion for public speaking, something he never thought he'd enjoy. During the final ceremony, he was one of the students chosen to give a speech. As he stood on the stage, looking out at the sea of faces, Jamal felt the familiar flutter of nerves. But then he thought of Alyssa's drawing, tucked safely in his bag, and his mother's words, "Be yourself, that's enough." So he spoke from the heart. He talked about his family, his neighborhood, and how small acts of kindness, like helping a war veteran up a ramp, could change lives. When he finished, the room erupted in applause. But what stayed with him most was the smile on Mr. Whitmore's face. When Jamal returned home, the neighborhood looked the same, but he felt different. The doubts and fears that had once weighed him down were still there, but they didn't control him anymore. He had a path now, a purpose, and for the first time, he truly believed that he could make a difference, not just for himself, but for everyone he cared about. As he stepped onto the porch, Maria and Alyssa were waiting for him, their faces alight with pride. Alyssa ran up to him, holding another drawing. This time, the superhero wasn't just standing tall. He was flying. "You did it," Maria said, pulling him into a hug. Jamal smiled. "We all did. Building a legacy." The next chapter of Jamal's life began quietly, without fanfare or dramatic announcements. But for him, the change was seismic. The experiences from the Whitmore Leadership Academy didn't fade when he returned home. Instead, they took root, growing stronger with each passing day. He was no longer the boy who walked with his head down, dodging Travis and his friends in the school hallways. Something inside him had shifted. He felt a newfound confidence, a steady strength that came not from his circumstances, but from within. Returning to school. Jamal's first day back at school was different. As he walked through the familiar hallways, the weight of judgment that usually hung over him seemed lighter. He carried himself differently, his shoulders squared, his gaze steady. When Travis called out, "Hey, Jamal," still dreaming of being a soldier, Jamal didn't flinch. Instead, he stopped, turned, and looked Travis in the eye. "Yeah," Jamal said, his voice calm but firm. "And I'll get there." For a moment, Travis looked taken aback. He opened his mouth to retort, but something about Jamal's unwavering stare made him pause. Instead, he muttered something under his breath and walked away, his group of friends trailing behind him. Jamal turned back to his locker, feeling a quiet satisfaction. He wasn't interested in confrontation, but standing up for himself felt like a small victory, a step toward becoming the person he wanted to be. Making a difference. Inspired by his time at the academy, Jamal decided to bring some of what he'd learned back to his community. He knew firsthand how hard it was for kids in his neighborhood to believe in themselves, to see beyond the cracked sidewalks and peeling paint of their world. So he started small. Using the connections he'd made through Mr. Whitmore and the program, Jamal organized a series of workshops at the community center. The sessions were simple: discussions about setting goals, finding strengths, and navigating challenges. At first, only a handful of kids showed up, most of them curious but skeptical. But word spread quickly. Jamal's approach was different from what they were used to. He didn't preach or lecture. He listened. He shared his own struggles, his fears, and how he'd worked through them. Slowly, the group grew. Kids who had once felt invisible started showing up week after week, eager to learn and share. One afternoon, a boy named Malik, no older than 10, approached Jamal after a session. Malik was small for his age, with a shy demeanor and a tendency to avoid eye contact. He tugged at Jamal's sleeve, holding out a crumpled piece of paper. "What's this?" Jamal asked, kneeling to Malik's level. "It's my dream," Malik said softly. Jamal unfolded the paper to find a drawing of a doctor standing in front of a hospital. The lines were shaky, but the message was clear. "You want to be a doctor?" Jamal asked, smiling. Malik nodded, his eyes lighting up. "But it's hard. My mom says we don't have money for college." Jamal placed a hand on Malik's shoulder. "Dreams are hard, Malik, but hard doesn't mean impossible. If this is what you want, you keep working for it, and I'll help you however I can." Malik's face broke into a wide grin, and in that moment, Jamal realized how powerful even the smallest encouragement could be. Family growth. At home, Maria continued to thrive in her nursing classes. Jamal often helped her study in the evenings, quizzing her on medical terms while Alyssa sat nearby, sketching superheroes. Their little house felt warmer these days, filled with laughter and the smell of real meals cooking in the kitchen. One night, Maria pulled Jamal aside after Alyssa had gone to bed. "I want to show you something," she said, leading him to the living room. On the wall where their father's photo hung, Maria had added a second frame. Inside was Jamal's certificate of completion from the Whitmore Leadership Academy. Jamal blinked, surprised. "Ma, you didn't have to do that." Maria smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "You've earned it, Jamal. You've made me proud. And you've given Alyssa someone to look up to." Jamal stared at the certificate, his heart swelling. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a symbol of how far he'd come, and how far he still had to go. A new challenge. As the months passed, Jamal began to set his sights higher. He'd always admired his father's service in the army, but now he wanted to follow in those footsteps with a purpose of his own. One afternoon, he sat down with Mr. Pottle to discuss his plans. "I think I want to apply to a military academy," Jamal said, the words feeling both exciting and terrifying as he spoke them. Mr. Pottle leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "That's a big goal, Jamal. Do you feel ready for it?" "I don't know," Jamal admitted. But I want to try. I want to do something that matters. Mr. Patel nodded slowly. Then let's make it happen. You'll need strong academics, leadership experience, and community involvement. But you've already started building all of that. The rest is just putting in the work. Jamal spent the next year pouring himself into his studies, his workshops, and his mentorship at the community center. The road wasn't easy. There were setbacks and moments of doubt. But he kept going, fueled by the lessons he'd learned and the support of those around him. Mr. Henderson's gift. One evening, as Jamal was heading home from the community center, he saw Mr. Henderson sitting on his porch. The old veteran waved him over, a familiar twinkle in his eye. "You've been busy, kid," Mr. Henderson said as Jamal sat down on the steps. "Trying to be," Jamal replied with a grin. Mr. Henderson reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I've been holding on to this for a while," he said, handing it to Jamal. "Figured you might be ready for it now." Jamal unfolded the paper to find a handwritten letter of recommendation. It was addressed to the admissions office of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. "Mr. Henderson," Jamal's voice caught in his throat. "You didn't have to." "I did," Mr. Henderson interrupted, his tone firm. "You're the kind of young man this country needs, Jamal. You've got heart, and you've got grit. That'll take you far." Jamal stared at the letter, his hands trembling. He felt a mix of gratitude, determination, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "I won't let you down." A new beginning. The day Jamal submitted his application to West Point was one of the proudest moments of his life. It wasn't just an application. It was a testament to how far he'd come. From the boy with worn-out shoes to the young man determined to make a difference. As he stood outside the post office, watching the letter disappear into the mailbox, he thought about his father, his mother, Alyssa, and everyone who had helped him along the way. He wasn't just chasing a dream for himself. He was building a legacy for all of them. No matter what happened next, Jamal knew one thing for certain. He was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. A dream realized. The letter came on a brisk autumn morning. Jamal was sitting at the kitchen table, helping Alyssa finish her math homework, when the mail truck rumbled down their street. It was a sound he'd heard countless times before, but today it sent a jolt of nerves through his chest. "I'll get it," Alyssa shouted, hopping off her chair and darting toward the door. Jamal watched her go, his heart racing. He knew the letter could arrive any day now, but part of him had avoided thinking about it too much. He wasn't sure he was ready to face whatever it might say. Alyssa came back a moment later, clutching a thick envelope. "Jamal, it's for you," she exclaimed, her voice bubbling with excitement. Maria appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her eyes locked onto the envelope, her expression a mix of hope and anxiety. "Go on, baby," she said softly. "Open it." Jamal took the envelope, his hands trembling. The return address read United States Military Academy, West Point. He stared at the seal for a moment, then carefully tore it open. The letter inside was printed on thick, official paper. He unfolded it slowly, his breath catching in his throat as he began to read. "Dear Mr. Hayes," it began. "Congratulations. We are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted to the United States Military Academy at West Point for the upcoming academic year." Jamal froze, the words blurring on the page. He read them again, just to be sure he wasn't imagining things. "Did you get in?" Alyssa asked, bouncing on her toes. Jamal looked up, his face breaking into a wide grin. "I got in," he whispered, then louder. "I got in." Maria let out a cry of joy, pulling him into a tight hug. "I knew you could do it, Jamal," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Your dad would be so proud." Alyssa joined the hug, laughing and cheering. "My big brother's going to West Point," she declared, her voice filled with pride. For a moment, the world felt perfect. All the struggles, the sleepless nights, the doubts, they all faded away, replaced by a sense of accomplishment that Jamal had never felt before. He had done it. He had turned his dream into reality. A farewell to the neighborhood. The months leading up to his departure were bittersweet. While Jamal was excited about the opportunities that lay ahead, he also felt a deep connection to the community that had shaped him. He spent his final weeks organizing one last series of workshops at the community center, determined to leave something behind for the kids who would come after him. At his final session, Malik approached him again. The shy boy had grown more confident over the months, and this time he handed Jamal a new drawing. It was of Jamal, wearing a West Point uniform, standing tall in front of the American flag. "I'm going to miss you," Malik said, his voice quiet but steady. Jamal crouched down to meet his gaze. "I'm going to miss you too, Malik. But you've got big dreams, and I know you're going to make them happen." "You think so?" Malik asked, his eyes wide. "I know so," Jamal replied. "And when you become a doctor, I expect an invitation to your graduation." Malik beamed, clutching the drawing tightly. "You've got it." The day of departure. The morning of his departure was clear and cool. A small crowd had gathered outside Jamal's house to see him off. Neighbors, friends, and even a few of his teachers. Mr. Henderson was there, too, standing tall in his wheelchair, his military jacket pressed and neat. "I'm proud of you, kid," Mr. Henderson said, saluting Jamal as he loaded his bags into the car. Jamal returned the salute, his chest swelling with emotion. "I wouldn't be here without you, sir." Mr. Henderson chuckled. "You would have found your way. You've got the heart for it." Maria hugged Jamal tightly, tears streaming down her face. "You take care of yourself out there, Jamal. And don't forget, you've got a family here who loves you." "I won't, Ma," Jamal promised, his voice cracking. "I'll make you proud." Alyssa handed him one final drawing, a superhero flying above the clouds, with the words "Go be amazing" scrawled at the bottom. "You're my hero," she said, hugging him tightly. Jamal climbed into the car, his heart heavy but full. As they drove away, he looked back at the little house, the peeling paint, and the faces of the people who had supported him every step of the way. He vowed to carry their love and encouragement with him, no matter where life took him. West Point, the beginning of a new journey. Arriving at West Point was like stepping into a different world. The campus was massive and imposing, filled with the buzz of cadets in sharp uniforms and the echoes of drills in the distance. Jamal felt a pang of nervousness as he joined the line of new cadets, each one looking just as anxious as he felt. The first weeks were grueling. The physical training pushed him to his limits, and the academic workload was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. But every time he felt like giving up, he thought of his family, of Mr. Henderson's words, of the kids at the community center who believed in him. He pushed through the exhaustion, the doubts, the homesickness. Slowly, he began to find his footing. His leadership skills, honed through years of struggle and his time at the Whitmore Academy, set him apart. His fellow cadets started looking to him for guidance, and his instructors took notice. One day, during a leadership exercise, Jamal was tasked with leading his squad through a complex obstacle course. The challenge required teamwork, strategy, and quick thinking, all things Jamal had spent years developing. By the end of the exercise, his squad finished first, earning praise from the instructors. "That's the kind of leadership we need here, Hayes," one of them said. "Keep it up." Homecoming. Months later, Jamal returned home for the first time since leaving for West Point. The neighborhood looked the same, but Jamal felt like a different person. He was greeted with cheers and hugs from neighbors, and Maria cooked a feast to celebrate his return. As they sat around the table, Alyssa showed him her latest drawings, and Maria shared updates on her nursing classes. Jamal listened, soaking in every moment. This was what he was working for, not just his dreams, but theirs too. That evening, Jamal and Maria stood outside, looking up at the stars. "You've come so far," Maria said, her voice filled with pride. "But I always knew you would." Jamal nodded, his gaze steady. I couldn't have done it without you. Meh. She smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. Just promise me one thing. What's that? Never stop dreaming, she said, because I know you'll make every one of them come true. Jamal looked back at their little house, the place where his journey had begun. He thought of all the challenges he'd faced, the people who had believed in him, and the possibilities that lay ahead. I promise, he said, rising to the call. The following year at West Point pushed Jamal in ways he never thought possible. The days were long, starting before sunrise and often stretching late into the night. The academics were intense, the physical demands unrelenting, and the expectations sky-high. Yet for every challenge that threatened to overwhelm him, Jamal found a way to rise above it. Each morning as he laced up his boots, he reminded himself of the faces back home. Maria's tired but hopeful eyes, Alyssa's innocent grin, and Mr. Henderson's steadfast encouragement. They were his anchors, the reason he kept moving forward. Building bonds. Jamal quickly discovered that West Point wasn't just about personal achievement. It was about teamwork. No cadet could succeed alone. During a grueling survival exercise in the forest, Jamal's squad was tasked with building a makeshift shelter and rationing their limited supplies. The biting wind and relentless rain tested their endurance and patience. One of his squad mates, Liam, a tall, wiry cadet from New York City, struggled to keep up. His hands shook as he tried to tie knots, and his face was pale from the cold. Some of the others grew frustrated, muttering under their breath. But Jamal stepped in. Liam, he said, crouching beside him, you're not in this alone. Let's work together. Jamal guided Liam through the steps, taking extra time to ensure he understood. By the end of the exercise, their shelter was the strongest in the group, and their squad had earned the highest marks. Liam pulled Jamal aside afterward, his voice thick with emotion. Thanks, man, he said. I was ready to give up back there. Jamal shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. That's what we're here for, to have each other's backs. Word of Jamal's quiet leadership began to spread. He wasn't the loudest or the most assertive cadet, but his steady presence and willingness to help others made him someone people naturally gravitated toward. Instructors started assigning him more responsibilities, and his peers began looking to him for guidance. Facing the past. One afternoon, during a history lecture, the professor projected a photo of soldiers in the heat of battle. Jamal's breath caught when he recognized the patch on one of the uniforms. It was the same one his father had worn. Memories of his father flooded his mind. The pride he felt whenever his dad came home in uniform. The stories Maria had shared of his bravery. After class, Jamal approached the professor. Sir, the unit in that photo, was it deployed during the Gulf War? The professor nodded. Yes, one of the most decorated units of that time. Do you have a connection to it? Jamal hesitated, then said, My father served in that unit. He didn't make it home. The professor's expression softened. Your father's sacrifice is part of why you're here, Cadet Hayes. You carry his legacy, but you're also building your own. Never forget that. Jamal walked out of the lecture hall, the weight of his father's memory heavier than usual. That night, he pulled out the old photo Maria had packed in his belongings, a picture of his father in uniform, standing tall and proud. Jamal stared at it for a long time, then placed it on his desk as a reminder of where he came from and what he was fighting for. A leadership opportunity. Midway through his second year, Jamal was nominated for a prestigious leadership role, squad leader for one of the incoming cadet groups. It was a significant responsibility, requiring him to mentor younger cadets while balancing his own demanding schedule. When the announcement was made, Jamal felt a mix of pride and doubt. Could he really handle the pressure? But then he thought of his journey, the struggles he'd overcome, the people who believed in him. He'd faced bigger challenges before. During his first meeting with the new cadets, Jamal stood at the front of the room, his hands clasped behind his back. The cadets, fresh-faced and nervous, watched him expectantly. Jamal cleared his throat, the words coming slower than he expected. "When I first got here," he began, "I felt like I didn't belong. I wasn't the smartest, the strongest, or the fastest. But I learned something important. Success here isn't about being the best. It's about showing up every day, giving your all, and helping the person next to you do the same." The cadets listened intently, their shoulders relaxing slightly as Jamal continued. "You're going to face challenges, and there will be times when you want to quit. When that happens, remember why you're here and who you're doing this for. And remember, you're not alone. We're in this together." By the end of his speech, the room felt lighter. Several cadets approached him afterward, thanking him for his words. Jamal realized then that leadership wasn't about having all the answers. It was about showing others they could find the strength within themselves. Returning home, Jamal's second year at West Point ended with him receiving high marks for leadership and academic performance. When he returned home for the summer, he was greeted with the same warmth and pride that had carried him through his journey so far. Maria had completed her nursing program and was working at a local clinic, while Alyssa had started a small art club at school, inspired by Jamal's workshops. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Maria handed Jamal a scrapbook. Inside were photos, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes. One page featured an article about the workshops Jamal had started at the community center, titled "Local Teen Inspires Change." "I kept this for you," Maria said, her voice soft, "so you'll always remember how far you've come." Jamal flipped through the pages, his chest tightening with emotion. The scrapbook wasn't just a collection of memories. It was a testament to the impact he'd made, the lives he touched. He looked up at Maria, his voice thick. "Thank you, Ma. You're building something special, Jamal," she said. "And it's only the beginning." Answering the call. As Jamal entered his final year at West Point, he faced his biggest challenge yet, preparing for his first active duty assignment. The thought of stepping into the real world, of facing the realities of military service, was daunting. But Jamal felt ready. His experiences had shaped him into a leader, someone who could face fear and uncertainty with courage. When the day of his commissioning ceremony arrived, Jamal stood in his full uniform, the weight of the moment sinking in. Maria and Alyssa were in the audience, their faces beaming with pride. Mr. Henderson had made the trip too, his military jacket adorned with its medals. As Jamal took the oath, his voice steady and clear, he thought of everything that had brought him to this moment. The sacrifices of his father, the love of his family, the lessons of his community. He wasn't just standing there for himself. He was standing for all of them. When the ceremony ended, Maria hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "You did it, Jamal," she whispered. "You made your dreams come true." Jamal smiled, looking at Alyssa, who held up a new drawing. This time, it was of Jamal standing on a mountaintop, the sun rising behind him. "Keep climbing," she said with a grin. And Jamal knew he would. The journey wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Leading by example. The first day of Jamal's active duty assignment was a mixture of nerves and anticipation. He had been placed in charge of a small platoon, a diverse group of soldiers with varying levels of experience. As a second lieutenant, Jamal knew the expectations were high, not just to lead, but to earn the respect of those under his command. The base was sprawling, with barracks, training grounds, and equipment depots spread out over acres. The air was thick with the scent of diesel fuel and the faint aroma of pine from the surrounding forest. Jamal stood on the edge of the parade ground, his uniform crisp, his boots polished. His platoon, numbering 30 soldiers, stood in formation, awaiting his first address. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Good morning, everyone. I'm Lieutenant Hayes." The soldiers' eyes locked on him, their expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. Jamal knew he had to strike the right tone, confident, but approachable. He thought back to his time at West Point, to the mentors who had guided him, and to the lessons he had learned in his own neighborhood. "I'm not here to pretend I have all the answers," he began, "but I promise you this. I will lead from the front. I will listen. And I will never ask you to do something I wouldn't do myself." There was a moment of silence, then a few nods. Jamal could sense the tension easing, the beginnings of trust forming. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Challenges in the field. The first few weeks were grueling. The platoon was tasked with a series of field exercises designed to simulate real combat scenarios. Jamal quickly learned that leading in theory and leading in practice were two very different things. During one exercise, the platoon was tasked with navigating a dense forest at night while carrying full gear and setting up a defensive position. The terrain was unforgiving, and the soldiers were tired and irritable. Halfway through the march, Private Torres, a young soldier with a wiry frame, tripped over a root and twisted his ankle. Jamal noticed the stumble and immediately called for a halt. "Torres, you okay?" he asked, crouching beside him. Torres grimaced, shaking his head. "I can keep going, sir. Don't slow everyone down for me." Jamal shook his head. "This isn't about slowing down. It's about making sure everyone gets through this together." He instructed two other soldiers to redistribute Torres's gear and help the young private to his feet. Jamal walked beside him the rest of the way, offering steady encouragement. By the time they reached their destination, the platoon was exhausted but intact. The next morning, Torres approached Jamal during breakfast. "Thank you, sir," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "A lot of leaders would have left me behind." Jamal nodded. "A good team doesn't leave anyone behind, Torres. Remember that." Earning their trust. Word of Jamal's leadership style spread quickly. He wasn't the kind of officer who barked orders from a distance. When the platoon was assigned to dig trenches, Jamal was right there in the dirt with them, shovel in hand. When they faced harsh weather during training, he endured it alongside them without complaint. During a particularly brutal endurance test, one of the senior non-commissioned officers, Sergeant Hargrove, approached Jamal. Hargrove was a seasoned soldier, known for his no-nonsense demeanor and skepticism toward new officers. "You're different, Lieutenant," Hargrove said, his tone grudging but respectful. "Most fresh-out-of-school officers think they're too good for the grunt work. But you put in the same sweat we do." Jamal shrugged. "I've learned that respect isn't given, it's earned. And I've got a lot of respect for what you and the others do, Sergeant." Hargrove nodded, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "You'll do fine, sir. A crisis in the making." The true test of Jamal's leadership came a few months later during a live training exercise in the desert. The platoon was tasked with coordinating a mock evacuation under simulated combat conditions. Everything was going smoothly until the radio communications failed. Without clear instructions from the command center, confusion quickly spread. "Lieutenant Hayes, we've lost contact," shouted Corporal Jenkins, the communications officer. Jamal's mind raced as he surveyed the situation. The heat was blistering, the soldiers were scattered, and the clock was ticking. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. Panic wouldn't help anyone. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "We stick to the plan as much as possible. Jenkins, try to reestablish contact. Hargrove, take half the squad and secure the extraction point. I'll stay here with the rest and coordinate the perimeter." The soldiers moved quickly, their trust in Jamal evident, as they followed his orders without hesitation. Jamal worked alongside them, directing movements, solving problems, and keeping morale high. By the time communications were restored, the platoon had completed the exercise successfully, earning praise from the evaluators. "You kept a cool head out there, Lieutenant," Hargrove said afterward. "That's what separates a good leader from a great one." A letter from home. Amid the challenges and triumphs, Jamal stayed connected to his family. Letters from Maria and Alyssa were a constant source of comfort. Alyssa's sketches continued to improve, and Maria often sent pictures of their little house, now painted a fresh coat of white. One day, Jamal received a thick envelope from Melissa. Inside was a new drawing. Jamal standing in front of his platoon. A caption reading, "My brother is a hero." Jamal smiled, his chest tightening with pride and love. Alyssa's belief in him was unshakable, and it fueled his determination to keep going. Becoming a mentor. As time went on, Jamal began mentoring younger officers and enlisted soldiers. He shared his experiences, offering advice and encouragement to those who struggled with the demands of military life. During one mentoring session, a young cadet named Martinez approached him. "Sir, how do you deal with the pressure? I feel like I'm always one mistake away from letting everyone down." Jamal looked at Martinez thoughtfully. "Pressure's always going to be there," he said. "But the key is remembering why you're here. Think about the people you're doing this for, the ones who believe in you, who count on you. And remember, you don't have to be perfect. You just have to keep trying." Martinez nodded, his expression lighter. "Thanks, sir. That helps." A legacy in motion. By the end of his first deployment, Jamal had established himself as a leader who not only excelled but inspired. His platoon's performance consistently ranked among the best, and his soldiers spoke highly of him to anyone who would listen. When Jamal returned home on leave, the neighborhood welcomed him back with open arms. Maria had organized a small celebration, and neighbors filled their backyard with laughter, food, and stories. Mr. Henderson pulled Jamal aside during the gathering, his eyes twinkling. "You've made me proud, kid," he said. "You've taken what you learned here and turned it into something bigger." Jamal smiled, his heart full. "I couldn't have done it without you, sir." As the night wore on, Jamal stood on the porch, watching the people who had shaped him. He thought of how far he'd come, from the boy with worn shoes to a leader with a purpose. He wasn't done yet. There were more challenges to face, more lives to impact. But for now, he allowed himself to feel the joy of the moment. The future was bright, and Jamal was ready for it.